We're going to start with our chapter goals for this section, Section J. And I want to tell you that it's also the goals for the rest of our semester because we are now starting on a topic called metabolism, and that's going to be about 5 or 6 chapters that cover all of how your body makes molecules, breaks them down, and uses energy. So, in this particular chapter, we have to introduce the ideas that we're going to be using for the rest of the semester. So, in this chapter, we're going to talk about how does the body gain and use energy. And that's something that's really fundamental about our existence. We know that we take in food, that is, sugars, fats, and proteins for energy. But why is it that food has energy and other things don't? And how do we get that energy out of there and make it allow us to do things like walk and talk and all of the other things our body does? Second of all, we're going to be talking about a lot of reactions and a lot of enzymes. And one important thing is how do you predict whether a reaction is going forward or backwards or not at all? That takes a long introduction and is probably the harder part for us to discuss here. Now, metabolism covers some very basic things in our life. For instance, why do we eat? I mean, we know that we eat food, which is going to be carbohydrates and fats and proteins, that is, lipids, proteins. We eat these things because they give us energy. But why do they give us energy when other things like rocks, we can't eat rocks and get energy out of it? Well, that's something we're going to have to develop. Now, when we take proteins and lipids and carbohydrates, fats, things like that, we break them down, we tend to break them into smaller molecules. Things like pyruvate, which we haven't talked about yet, acetyl-CoA, which we also haven't talked about yet, and ultimately all the way down to CO2, which is when we've taken all the energy out of food and we have nothing left to do with that carbon and other than to exhale it. Now, when we break down molecules in this fashion, get energy out of them, it's called catabolism. That's the branch of metabolism that involves breaking things down and getting energy out. But there's another type of metabolism that's called anabolism, and that's when we take energy and put it into smaller molecules and make them into the bigger molecules. After all, carbohydrates and fats and proteins have to come from somewhere, and we make them and plants make them through the process of anabolic pathways. Now, there's an important principle here when we look at this overview, and that is when we take these larger molecules on the top and make them into CO2, how do we get energy out of that? And the answer is not because we're making them into smaller things that we end up having energy released. And I can prove that to you because think about the smallest carbon molecule we can make, which is methane. That's small, but it contains a tremendous amount of energy, and we can get a lot of energy out of it. So what is it that happens when we take these molecules and make them into these molecules? The answer is something that's probably a little bit new, and we're going to have to deal with it extensively. And that is we are oxidizing the carbon in the top, and that is a process we call oxidation. If we take the smaller molecules and try to make them into those up here, that's a process called reduction. And we may remember a little bit about oxidation and reduction from our general chemistry, but if you don't worry, we're going to hit that heavily and very basically right from the start here in this chapter. Now, I'm going to just skip over this part for a second and show you a page that comes later in the chapter here. This is going to be a nice overview of some of the things we're going to be talking about for the next 5 weeks, 6 weeks. And this shows us a lot of different pathways, how we can interconvert molecules. For instance, taking polysaccharides like starch in our diet, breaking them down into sugars, and then breaking it down into pyruvate is a pathway called glycolysis. You may have heard that or studied it in other classes. We also have the citric acid cycle and beta oxidation. These are things we're going to ultimately go into quite a bit of detail on, and this is the overview of those pathways. Now let's back up again to this page. I want to introduce you to 4 different concepts that we're going to be studying again for the next 5 or 6 weeks as we go right through the end of the semester. And let's take a hypothetical pathway. When we say we're interested in studying metabolism, we have to understand what pathways are, and this is very theoretical. First of all, we have the term metabolites. That's simply the lettered molecules in the pathway. These are intermediates in a pathway. Let's say we have a molecule A and we want to make it into product 1. We need to go through the intermediates B, C, D, E, and F until we get to product 1. Notice that it's possible to make other products as well. We can go from A to B to C to D and then go on to a different pathway and branch off to either product 3 or product 2. And these kind of branch points are where we talk about key juncture molecules. These are going to be what we would call intersections on different pathways. If we think of pathways as roads, for instance, then you're going to have places where those 2 roads fork or where they cross each other. And in this case, molecule D, or metabolite D, would be a key juncture molecule because it can lead in 2 different directions. We also have irreversible and reversible directions. We won't get into the details too much here, but let me just make the point that most of these reactions are double directional arrows. That means we can convert B to C, or C can be converted back to B. And that's not true of all of them. For instance, A to B is a reaction that only proceeds in the forward direction. What we mean by that is not that you cannot chemically go back from B to A. It just means that you don't typically see that happen in the body. So it's biologically irreversible, not chemically irreversible. Notice something though, it's important. If there's one reaction that is irreversible in a pathway, that means the entire pathway is irreversible. We can go from A to product 1, but there's no way for us to get from product 1 back to A unless we go by some different route. So that's going to be important a little bit later. And lastly, and most importantly, I want to tell you about the 2 types of high energy intermediates. Remember, the top of the page told us that this is all about energy, and we want to be observing how energy is produced and taken away. And there are 2 different ways we can do that. They're very important, and that's really what we're going to spend most of the rest of this chapter talking about. The first high energy intermediate is what we call a phosphocompound. We've talked about phosphate a lot, and we've seen it attached to other molecules. And in certain cases, when we attach phosphate to another molecule, we get a very high energy storage. And the perfect example of that is ATP. You know that ATP is the biological currency of cells, or you may know that from your biology classes. Why is it that ATP is such a useful energy currency? And the second type of energy currency is a new one. That's called reducing power. That gets back to the oxidation reduction type processes that we talked about above. Now, this is a really hard one to describe, and we'll get to it in detail later. But if ATP is the currency of phosphate compounds, reducing power's currency is a molecule called NADH. That's a currency that is just as powerful, in fact, maybe more powerful than ATP. And we're going to be talking about both of these types of high energy intermediates right through the final exam, pretty much every time we have a lecture.